So we often hear enough from proponents of socialism, socialist sympathisers, that the USSR was not the true face of socialism. Here's a quote by Peter Hitchens. He says, "The other socialists were more honest than we were. Ours was the extreme version of pretending that the USSR was not the fault of socialists or even of Bolsheviks, which we wish to be. Of course, it was their fault, the fault of people exactly like us, but we closed our minds to this with a web of excuses. We pretended not to be who we were, and that the USSR was not what it was."
We're looking at more of the policies, beliefs, and events that surrounded the rule of Lenin and Stalin. It's a tale of tragedy, power, and betrayal.
Technically speaking, socialism is really just the one thing, and whether you believe in Marxism, libertarian socialism, democratic socialism, the problem in socialism is the fact that they fight with one another. And they do it because you cannot have your idea without having to force it upon another when it comes to socialism.
1917, a provisional government is formed after the fall of the Tsardom. Multiple parties lend their thoughts and a general set of rules is formed. An early government, certainly, but one of more diverse political leanings than the previous Tsardom. As we know, this isn't long-lived, and the Bolsheviks want more. Without much initial confrontation, they make it clear that this new government will not rely on multiple ideologies or parties. The Bolsheviks will rule all.
And so what you had was these different groups, different mindsets, fighting off against one another. And it was really just, different socialists all in a disagreement. And you even seen this in anarchist Catalonia, which wasn't really anarchist, as it descended into anarchy. Immediately afterwards, this special privileged group, even made up of many prisoners, had essentially formed a terror group. And this is the issue with socialism. In order to have their way, they have to force it upon other people.
The Bolsheviks' leadership believed that the current government would be inefficient at delivering policy and change. Also, they were just power-hungry guys.
When you have people of different conflicting views, they're going to go their own way. And in order for you to get your way, you're going to have to force your views upon other people. And that is why it always leads to the consolidation of power.
What exactly did the Bolsheviks want? Well, let's look at the leader, Vladimir Lenin. He followed the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This political ideology was called Marxism. At its core, it was quite relevant for the time, even if it was a bit short-sighted. Marxism saw class division as the core issue to a majority of the world's population. The argument was that the working class received little cut of the profits for the work they took part in, that those who control its distribution and sale receive a vast majority of profits, whereas the workers are effectively slaves to their corporate masters. Now remember that this was all in a time with horrific work conditions and hours in an increasingly industrialized world.
Again, it's this argument on the Industrial Revolution, as if they claim that they worked endless hours for such little pay, and that if it wasn't for government, wherever would we be? And so it's that claim, again, that we needed socialism to come along and save us. And then it's this idea that, there was these awful working conditions. You see, the way they paint the Industrial Revolution period of history is like the Shire of Lord of the Rings, and then one day along comes this big cloud of darkness over the top of them, Mordor, and that's the Industrial Revolution. That's the way they paint things, and they even bought into the rhetoric that there was a collapse of living standards in the first Industrial Revolution. I could go on and on and on, and even cover the myth on child exploitation, and how they were apparently poorly mistreated by that of the capitalist factory owners, etc, etc, etc. You cannot judge things from a still shot. In other words, you cannot look at a picture from the 1840s or even the late 19th century and say, look at here, there's awful living conditions. That doesn't tell you anything, because a still picture does not tell you whether there was progress or not. You cannot judge progress by looking at today's living conditions and wages, by then comparing it to the 1840s, for example. In order for you to judge progress, you're going to need to look at before the Industrial Revolution, to look at how life was, to look at how wages were.
Marxism believed that, as industrialization continues, the working class will become further entrenched in this sort of slavery. Marxism argues that due to this inevitability, nations of capitalist economic systems would undoubtedly fall to revolution.
The one thing that I've always laughed at about Marxism and the growth of the industrialisation, this idea that would lead to revolutions because of the slavery as such, oh, how enslaved it must have been for them to see their working hours reduce, their wages improving year in, year out. Most importantly, by the 1840s, them actually having food to put on their tables. How awful life must have been.
This revolution would be of the lower class taking political and economic power from the upper class. Of course, we know now that with workers' rights quickly advancing over the course of the 20th century, Marxist beliefs weren't entirely applicable.
If you look back in history hundreds of years ago, you had, Magna Carta, and that was individual rights. However, you didn't really have the same sort of rights back in that period. And things were strongly collectivist in many regards, such as the feudal age and stuff. And as things began to move away from that, and you saw a bit more of individualism in the scale, then yes, you began to see people having more and more rights. And so it was just really to do with the time period moving into the 20th century, if anything. And like I've said so many times before, if you look at Marxism as a whole, you have never really seen this idea of workers' ownership of anything.
But we weren't there yet. It argued that ideally no class division exists, and that there was indeed a way to achieve this. The first step was to implement socialism into a previously capitalist state. Now, socialism in itself is a vast sea of ideas that can't really be stripped down to a single mindset. Some ideologies want to abolish markets, some don't. Today, we see socialism implemented in a much less extremist method in various nations to some success.
Markets is to do with capitalism, so the people who believe in supporting socialism alongside a market essentially support that of a mixed economy, and those economies are not as good as what people make them out to be. The higher tax rates they do not benefit from, for example, and the issue with their unemployment rates, their severe lack of productivity. Again, I could go into a whole topic on that in a separate video.
This was not the socialism Marx had in mind. Socialism was just a footnote in the end goal of Marxism. As society adapts from capitalism to socialism, class divides would weaken. Over time, a new step is implemented to end all class division: communism. Communism ideally abolishes money and personal ownership of goods and land. When people work, the fruit of their labors reach the state and everything is equally distributed.
And that's the beginning of the end of the entire idea of Marxism in general, because once you do away with prices, you are finished. You're finished with efficiency, you're finished with the redistribution. You don't have the information or knowledge to know what people's needs and wants are. You don't know what resources to use. You don't know where to allocate them. You don't even know what to produce more of. You don't know how much to produce. You end up with a right big mess. That's pretty much why even the entire idea of Marxism is wholly irrational.
Now, in theory, this leads to a sort of utopia, where nobody strives to want more and nobody falls to have less. But humans always want more, and that's not always a bad thing. This desire to want more makes humans work harder, innovate, and find new ways to benefit society, while simultaneously benefiting oneself. Without actual benefits to working harder, nobody wants to work harder. Just do what needs to be done, and we all sustain ourselves in time. In hindsight, it wasn't a very good philosophy, but that hindsight is key. We now know that the 20th century would bring massive benefits to the standard of living to most of humanity.
It's rather rich that he talks about that of the Industrial Revolution period of history being so god-awful, and then he speaks about that of the living conditions that we have today. And no doubt his argument is down to this idea that it was somehow because of government that made that possible. And it's quite sad that people actually believe that. However, at least he is saying that yes, the idea of Marxism was completely, wholly irrational, but I don't actually think he understands why it failed. He only thinks that, oh well, an idea, it destroyed people's incentives and that's it, that's as far as it goes. He doesn't understand the economic reasons why it failed. He's got no understanding of the information of prices, the role of prices. Why, when you fix prices, this is the funny part, because this doesn't just apply to that of Marxism, this applies to all mixed economies. This is why the NHS in Britain is a disastrous failure.
Cars, planes, computers, the internet, all that were constantly improved over time due to human innovation. But this was not the world that Marx and Engels lived in. We are talking Gilded Age workers that were objectively in a very bad position. They saw the poor living in inhospitable conditions while the rich thrived.
This is utter nonsense. And here is a quote by Thomas J. DiLorenzo that points that out in his book, How Capitalism Saved America. Another indictment of the trusts was that even if they weren't monopolies, they were supposedly creating a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of top capitalists of the day. The conspicuous wealth of the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Stanfords, and others seemed to support this charge. But in reality, the nation's wealth was not being concentrated in the hands of the leading capitalists, as economic historians Robert Gray and James Peterson pointed out. From 1840 to 1900, the division of all income in America remained the same. Labour received 70% and property owners, capital and natural resource suppliers received 30%.
If there is a single word to describe Karl Marx, it's idealist. For Lenin, it's revolutionary. But for Joseph Stalin, it's evil.
They are all evil. Socialism as a whole is evil. It's immoral. It's a system that requires force on others. That's why if you look at the actions of Antifa very much live up to the true face of socialism and socialists, because they have to try and force their will upon other people to try and silence them.
Of course, he murders anybody opposing the Bolshevik rule. Having a different political philosophy is no more.
You're going on about these theoretical differences which mean nothing. The bottom line is, there really is no difference between a regime that's totalitarian to another regime that's totalitarian, and both are inherently collectivist, and that's really what it is. They both tried to put socialism into practice and failed miserably.
In 1928, Stalin began to demand the instant industrialization of the state. Along with this was the implementation of collectivism. Everything goes to the state. Farmers, who had previously little knowledge or care about the Kremlin's policies, suddenly were forced to give up their livestock and crops, stuff they needed to live. If they refused, they were killed. The original notion was that everything could just be distributed equally.
I really don't get the point of this argument, because yes, that's what they do with communism. That's the ultimate goal towards socialism, towards Marxism, is political centralisation, is collectivism.
But guess what? It didn't work. Because of this, mass famine resulted in somewhere between 3 and 7 million died. Why was this such a butchered operation? Why didn't distribution happen? Well, many suspect it was intentional. By limiting the food in Ukraine, any potential independence movements would be squashed. Since people are dying of starvation. If true, it means Stalin intentionally killed millions. This was on top of the flat-out political murders, which number around 500,000 or so.
The starvation would have happened regardless. When you centralise agriculture, you're destined for starvation, regardless of even if he forced it or not. That's communal ownership of property for you.
The real irony in all of this is whereas Marxism feared the worker becoming slave to the capitalist, workers were becoming quite literally slave to the state. Now we know that soon the Germans will invade, and a whole new struggle arises for the Soviet people. A non-aggression pact signed and dismissed. Former mortal enemies become brief political allies. And eventually Stalin's reign obviously ends. But seeing how this video is long enough, let's talk about Khrushchev at a later date. The Soviet Union is important because it shows one massive fault with actually applying those Marxist theories. At the end of the day, somebody still wants the power. Those who held the power in the Soviet Union lived in wealth and glamour, whereas the peasants were starving in the streets. Sure, it was thinly veiled as socialism or communism, but in reality it was just plain old authoritarianism.
This is laughable to say the least. You ignore the fact that under socialism you require the use of force in order to try and get rid of private individual ownership, and that is the goal of socialism. To say that, socialism isn't authoritarian is laughable. You've admitted that Marxism is utopian, and in reality we always see socialism go in the hands of government. It's always been the case. But what makes me laugh is the fact that you think that taking control over people's economic lives isn't authoritarian. Anyway, folk, be sure to share the video, like the video, of course it helps me greatly, and thank you for watching my video. If you've got any questions, comment in the comment section below, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.